Hey everyone, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. I just wanted to do a quick video on a topic that has quickly been becoming more or less a hobby of mine lately, and that is Catholic moral theology. Specifically, how do we go about forming our consciences, especially in light of issues that are confusing or that are debated among reputable Orthodox theologians? Really, like how does one go about forming our conscience? And this is an area that I definitely plan to make more videos about. And the reason is because I think many of the principles of moral theology, of Catholic moral theology, Catholic moral thinking, and the intellectual rigor with which it's been done over the centuries, I really think that needs to make a bit of a comeback in the life of the church. Not only in the face of, these liberal prelates running around trying to water down the church's teaching, but also in light of what I see even among more theologically inclined Catholics online, specifically, of the younger generation. They have a lot of zeal, but I think a lot of them tend to lack a firm foundation in how the church exercises moral reasoning in navigating specific and particular cases of moral acts. They're very good with the cherry-picked quotes from saints and posting those, which isn't always a bad thing. I think they're often helpful. But what's lacking, I think, is rigorous moral reasoning and the way the church has mastered the art over the centuries. And, I think this is partly due to the church's decisive shift away from, what is now derogatorily called casuistry, which is usually typified in like the manuals of moral theology, like the classical manuals, the manualist era. And granted, a lot of those can be read as, tomes of moral legalese, and there was, during that time period, a lack of focus, a lack of emphasis on the person as a whole and the growth of the interior life and deification and perfection and virtue. There was a tend toward legalism there, and there is much validity to that, and that it also led to kind of a spiritual aridity in the pastoral climate, things like that. But while I do share many of those modern critiques of the kind of casuistry that I'm talking about, like, that was at its height in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I don't think it can be denied that the church, in so doing that, has not borne much fruit in the realm of giving everybody moral clarity about issues or how to navigate through moral conundrums or moral questions. And as we, live in this age of relativism and modern thinking, those moral confusions crop up all the more, and we need to be equipped with the tools necessary to navigate that. And so that's what this video is about. And if you like my work, if you want to support the work that I'm doing, one great way to do that is patreon.com/classicaltheist. One of the things that you get is unlimited Q&A access per each month that you're subscribed. And you can do that through the Patreon messaging system or Telegram or Twitter. You also get monthly articles, monthly book recommendations, over 100 pages of catechetical notes on Catholic theology, among other notes from various streams that I've done and things like that. And you also get to choose a video topic that you'd like me to cover. So all kinds of stuff. So if you want to support me and get some extra content from me, that's a great way to do it. But back to the topic at hand. So, I think the main reason for a revival of maybe not manualism, but at least the systems, like the frameworks of forming one's conscience that was prevalent in the manualist era. I think a great reason why we need to revive that a little bit is because, especially in the age of the internet, it's not easy to get straightforward answers on moral questions about, especially, like I said, those questions about which Catholics disagree, Orthodox Catholics disagree, Orthodox moralists disagree. And the average confessor has likely not dealt with these questions at a level of nuance or precision anywhere near that of the average priest of 100 years ago, due to that pastoral shift. And so if lay Catholics are going to maneuver through the finer points of moral theology so as to thoroughly educate our consciences, as is our duty, I think it makes sense to revisit some of the scientific frameworks that have helped shape Catholic moral thinking for centuries. So what are these frameworks of navigating conscience, and which one do I think makes the most sense? So there are these competing systems out there, and we're going to talk through these, and I'll try to synthesize a little bit and articulate the position that I think makes the most sense. While you could subdivide these categories, these systems, almost indefinitely, like you can always make finer and finer distinctions, I think it's safe to say that there are about 5 main schools of thought that have stood out among moral theologians over the centuries. Now, 2 of them are condemned, so 2 of them are off limits for Catholics, but I'll still discuss them. So those are rigorism, probabilism, equiprobabilism, probabilism, and laxism. So that's rigorism, probabilism, equiprobabilism, probabilism, and laxism. So those are the systems, and we'll explain what all these mean. But rigorism, let's start with the rigorism. It also goes by the name of Tudiorism, and it was very popular among the Jansenists. But it's a condemned moral system, and essentially what it does is it rules out as immoral or as unlawful any action that favors liberty. And when I say favor liberty, I mean a course of action that essentially allows you to choose a desired action. Choose something that is desirable, that is desired or sought after, without any obstruction of a restricting law. Or it has to do with a freedom from obligation or a freedom from positive restriction in some moral area. Right, so that's what I mean by when I say an action favors liberty or an opinion favors liberty. So this system essentially rules out as immoral any action that favors liberty when there is a safer moral opinion that could be followed. Now, such a view was condemned by the Church, by Pope Alexander VIII, and for good reason. As it's virtually impossible to follow this in practice, and it essentially would constitute a near occasion of despair for anyone that's even slightly susceptible to scrupulosity, as a lot of us are these days. So rigorism is ruled out, and it's contrasted most sharply against the other condemned proposition or moral system, which is laxism. And this essentially teaches that you can safely follow any moral opinion so long as it is only slightly probable or even doubtfully probable. Now, such a view was condemned very vehemently by Pope Innocent XI, and therefore it's inadmissible for a Catholic to licitly hold this school of thought. But in the middle of these extremes are 3 Orthodox positions that a Catholic can illicitly hold, and those are probabilism, equiprobabilism, and pure probabilism. So let's break these down a bit. Probabilism. Now, while this is more pastorally admissible than rigorism, and nevertheless it kind of follows the same pastoral trend as rigorism by systematically putting in place a bias against moral opinions that favor liberty generally. So such opinions that favor liberty on this view could only be followed if it's certainly more probable than the more restrictive moral opinion. So certainly more probable. Now, While this is laudable for having great concern for following, the objective moral law at all costs, I think the vast majority of moral theologians basically see it as pastorally inadmissible, since it's basically putting undue burdens on lay faithful who are just not equipped to maneuver through the minutiae of nuance in moral debates that are discussed among theologians. And because of that inaccessibility there, it's kind of always going to err on the side of rigor. So it's kind of rigorism with extra steps, in other words. It may not be rigorism in principle, but it's kind of rigorism in practice. So I think the church kind of rightly moves away from that, and pastors tend to move away from that as well. But whereas probabilism can kind of be seen as a modification of rigorism, pure probabilism, on the other hand, is kind of seen as an orthodox modification of laxism. So according to this view, in cases of doubt, it's always lawful to follow an opinion that favors liberty so long as that opinion is considered certainly probable. And let's talk a little bit about the metrics that are in place to discern probability in moral questions. So certain probability is typically going to be measured by two primary metrics. So you got two main metrics here, and that would be extrinsic authority. So that means you have several moral authors of, good reputation are in agreement, or the view is at least defended by someone of very high esteem, such as St. Thomas Aquinas or Alphonsus Liguori. Okay, so that's extrinsic. Now, you want to avoid a couple of mistakes when you're using extrinsic authority. For one, just because a great figure like St. Thomas or St. Alphonsus holds a position doesn't automatically make it more probable overall. It just means that it sort of guarantees solid probability on the side of extrinsic authority. But that doesn't mean it's more probable than the contrary opinion by itself. But typically, in order to establish solid probability, you can either have the support of one of these guys, like Thomas Aquinas or Alphonsus Liguori, or a handful of reputable moralists that are, of high caliber, high esteem, very highly respected, right? And if you have like a handful of those guys, that's enough for solid probability in the order of extrinsic authority. But then you have intrinsic probability, right? And this is basically having to do with the intrinsic force of moral argumentation. So whenever we're dealing with moral questions, you can't really escape the obligation to use your mind, to use your reason, to evaluate arguments on the basis of their logical soundness, right? You can't really avoid that, because that's another essential element of establishing probability. If you have an opinion that may be backed up by some moralists, but it's just clearly absurd, well, then that's going to impact the overall probability of the opinion. So that's how you kind of measure out probability in an action. And most moralists today, I would say, are basically probabilists. St. Alphonsus Liguori was once a probabilist, but then he became an equiprobabilist. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. And that's in between probabilism and pure probabilism. We have equiprobabilism, which, as I said, is St. Alphonsus' position in his later years. The great moralist, I never figured out how to pronounce his name properly, but I believe he goes by Aertnes. If that's a horrible pronunciation, feel free to laugh at me in the comments. It's fine. But he was a very reputable moralist of the early 20th century, and he had this definition of equiprobabilism. So he says, quote, "When there are conflicting opinions which are equally or almost equally probable, it is lawful to follow the opinion in favor of liberty when doubt relates to the existence of a law. But if the doubt concerns the cessation of a law, the law continues to bind. So we don't really have to talk about cessations, because when we're dealing with morality, the natural law, we're not dealing with questions of cessation. This has to do with positive law, right? But with the natural law, we're always talking about the existence of a law. In other words, is an action sinful or is it not sinful? If it is sinful, is it morally sinful or is it venially sinful? That pertains to the being of a law or its ontological status. So he's basically saying that if you have two conflicting opinions that are equally or almost equally probable, you can basically choose either one. And this system is supported by St. Alphonsus, but it's not actually favored by most moralists today. As I say, they tend to mostly be probabilists. So which of these systems basically do I regard as most sensible? Well, in my view, it would have to be somewhere between probabilism and equiprobabilism. I'm going to be one of those people that's going to introduce a finer distinction in between these two. And essentially, I think, to sum up my view, I guess, one could choose in favor of liberty if and only if the following criteria are met. Now, again, this is my opinion, so feel free to make of this what you will. But I've done a lot of reading on this. So the first criteria would be the viewpoint is not contradicted by the magisterial teachings of the church. So that should be considered a given, right? If the viewpoint is condemned by the magisterium, it doesn't really matter what the intrinsic arguments are, what the extrinsic arguments are. You have the magisterium, and that's the teaching authority that's binding universally on all the faithful. So that's one thing. This doesn't, in other words, this method doesn't work for issues like contraception, issues like abortion, issues like in vitro fertilization. The magisterium has clearly come down on these issues, has settled the matter, has exercised its judgment, and that is all we need to be morally bound as Catholics. So that's the first one. So we're really talking about issues about which the magisterium hasn't intervened, and there's debate among Orthodox theologians. So that's the first one. The second one, though, is that it's solidly probable by both intrinsic and extrinsic arguments. So it has to be solid probability, and we already talked about how to establish that. So they have to be solidly probable, and that's all probabilists agree with that. But the third one, I would say that you have to, at the very least, be able to demonstrate through intrinsic argumentation that the opinion in favor of liberty has no intrinsic defeaters, and that intrinsic arguments against liberty fail. So this is where I would add some dose of equiprobabilism into the mix, where at the end of the day, you do have to come to the view that the opinion in favor of liberty is more likely true than not. And if it's kind of a wash with extrinsic arguments or extrinsic authors, extrinsic authority, in other words, you establish solid probability for both views on the basis of extrinsic authority, then it's the intrinsic category that I think is going to do the heavy lifting. So this system, I think it provides a strong defense against both rigorism and against laxism. So against rigorism, it essentially allows for conscience to have some autonomy to safely choose in favor of liberty in some situations, and therefore not be overburdened by scrupulosity. Now, against laxism, the system ensures that greater care is taken for the objective moral law than for what one just personally wants to do, according to their personal desires or attachments to sin or whatever. So in other words, if you're going to follow an opinion that favors liberty, it still has got to be shown that the opinion is more likely true than not according to objective criteria of moral discernment. Otherwise, one would essentially just be following a doubtful conscience, which is never permissible. Against rigorism, this view provides sufficient room for individual moral discernment, and so it guards against the irrational scrupulosity that really plagues a lot of people. And I think it's also a good guard against laxism too, by requiring us to still establish some greater probability for the view that favors liberty. So if an opinion that favors liberty truly accords, therefore, with reason and is supported by enough learned men of the church, a Catholic can follow that opinion without laboring under constant fear of eternal damnation, something very much needed, I think, for scrupulous souls. So all in all, I think that this provides the best practical roadmap for someone to use when dealing with disputed questions in moral theology. So we can, as it says in the Benedictus, serve the Lord without fear. So I hope the wrong kind of fear, of course. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you got something out of this. Let me know in the comments what you think. Which system do you think makes the most sense? What do you think about manualism, right? What do you think about reviving a bit of that? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want to support my work, again, patreon.com/classicaltheist, and I'll be making more videos and more content about moral theology going forward. God bless you. Hey everyone, how's it going?